The year is 1849. The American Republic is perched on a brittle edge, its soul cleaved by the institution of chattel slavery. In Richmond, Virginia, a man named Henry Brown worked in a tobacco factory, his labor owned by a distant master, his life governed by a brutal, immutable law. He was, by the world's standard, mere property. But Henry Brown possessed a heart and mind that transcended the chains of his circumstances, and he held a secret, a grief so profound it would eventually inspire one of the most astonishing acts of self-liberation in the history of the Underground Railroad, an act that was equal parts industrial logistics, supreme physical endurance, and sheer, audacious faith. This is the true story of how Henry Brown shipped himself to freedom, a tale of agonizing confinement and spectacular resurrection, which profoundly shaped the turbulent decade leading up to the Civil War. His existence in Richmond was defined by the terrible tension between the small privileges his industry had earned him and the total lack of control over his own destiny. He had been allowed to marry Nancy, a woman enslaved on a different plantation, and together they had 3 children, with a 4th on the way. Henry had even achieved a small, precarious degree of financial autonomy, paying his master a portion of his factory earnings in a tenuous arrangement that shielded his family from the auction block. He clung to a private, verbal promise from his owner that his family would never be sold. That promise, a fragile whisper of hope in the howling wilderness of slavery, was shattered in the late summer of 1848. The enslaver, needing money, dismissed the promise as conveniently as a discarded receipt. Nancy, pregnant, and their 3 children, the whole fragile world Henry had painstakingly constructed, were sold and transported south to the cotton fields of North Carolina. It was not merely a sale. It was an amputation. The separation, the forced, absolute erasure of his family from his life broke Henry Brown. His grief was a vast, open wound that would not heal, a psychological trauma so deep that it made the physical dangers of escape seem secondary, even trivial. He later wrote of the anguish that drove him. He had reached a point where he determined to die or be free, for life under the lash of such emotional devastation was no life at all. His initial thoughts turned to traditional flight, the arduous, perilous journey by foot through swamps and forests, hiding by day and moving by the North Star. But Henry, a public figure of sorts even in his constrained life, a member of the local church choir, a known factory worker, felt the odds were stacked too high against him. He needed an innovative, shocking, and most importantly, impersonal method of transport, something that would bypass the human element of slave patrols and bounty hunters. He needed to become a piece of industrial chattel himself, indistinguishable from the goods that drove the Southern economy. The revelation arrived with the stark clarity of a vision. He would mail himself to freedom. The plan was monumentally risky, bordering on the suicidal. It required the complicity of 3 people: Henry himself, a free black shopkeeper and friend named James Caesar Anthony Smith, and a white shoemaker and sometime gambler, Samuel Alexander Smith, no relation to James Caesar. The white man's participation was crucial, as only he could secure the necessary shipping arrangements in Richmond, the heart of the slave-trading South. Henry raised the astounding sum of $86, a fortune carved from years of merciless saving, to pay Samuel Smith for his aid.
On March 23, 1849, the 3 men gathered in a secret space. The instrument of Henry's liberation was a crude wooden crate, measuring exactly 3 feet long, 2 feet 6 inches deep, and 2 feet wide, barely large enough to contain a man in a cramped fetal position. Within the box, they bored a few small air holes, strategically hidden but entirely insufficient for any comfortable breathing. Henry, to secure the day off from the tobacco factory without raising suspicion, had performed one final necessary act of self-mutilation. He chemically burned his own hand with sulfuric acid. The pain was excruciating, but it guaranteed his absence from work and served as a powerful ritualistic severing of his ties to the world of bondage. He squeezed into the box, placing a small glass bottle of water and a few biscuits inside. His knees pressed against his chest, his head bent low. Before Samuel Smith nailed the lid shut, a final chilling inscription was applied to the exterior of the box. "This side up with care." The irony was a grim testament to the fact that his human value was now purely defined by the caution given to a piece of commercial cargo. The box was addressed to the office of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society in Philadelphia, specifically to the attention of one of the city's most prominent abolitionists, James Miller McKim. The journey began with a slow, agonizing haul by wagon to the Richmond train depot, then onto the railroad, and finally a transfer onto a steamboat for the passage up the Potomac River to Washington, D.C. It was here, during the steamboat leg of the journey, that Henry nearly perished, and the phrase, "this side up with care," was tragically ignored. The handlers, indifferent to the faint scratching or the light, muffled movements within, violently tipped the crate over and placed it upside down, using it as a convenient flat surface upon which to rest other cargo. Henry was thrown into an agonizing inversion. The blood rushed to his head, pooling and throbbing in his brain. The pressure built, the air holes were blocked, and he began to choke, his lungs screaming for oxygen. He felt the cold, suffocating grip of death closing around him, his consciousness flickering like a candle in a gale. He endured the ordeal, unable to cry out, knowing that a single sound of distress would betray him and condemn him to certain capture, torture, and re-enslavement, a fate far worse than death in the box. He would later write that he prayed in that moment, offering his final breath to God. For hours he remained upside down until, by some miraculous chance or a slight shift in the boat's load, the crate was turned right side up again. The agonizing pressure slowly subsided, the flow of blood reversed, and he gulped the meager, stale air through the pinholes. He survived the first major test of his ordeal, but the 27-hour journey, a distance of 350 miles, was far from over. From Washington, the box continued its anonymous route, traveling by rail through Baltimore, which, though technically in a non-slave state, was a notorious hub for slave catchers who roamed the depots and streets in search of runaways. Every jolt, every sudden stop, every rough handling by a porter was a fresh spike of panic. Through the thin walls of his wooden prison, Henry could hear the clamor of the world passing by, the guttural shouts of the workmen, the metallic shriek of the train wheels, the casual conversations of free men. He was a silent ghost traversing the geography of American liberty. Finally, in the early hours of March 24, 1849, the crate was delivered to the express office in Philadelphia. James Miller McKim and a small, trembling group of abolitionists, including the great conductor of the Underground Railroad, William Still, were waiting. The moment of truth had arrived. The crate was retrieved and taken to the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society office, where it was reverently placed on the floor. McKim, his hands shaking, tapped on the lid and asked in a low voice, "Is all right within?" A muffled voice, weak but clear, replied from inside the box, "All is right." The sound electrified the room. It was the confirmation of a miracle, of